In this game against Mazoli from the 1984 New York Open, I demonstrate the connection between a weakness at f7 and a weakness at a8. My opponent is aware of the danger and tries to defend, but using a sacrifice, I manage to exploit the weakness anyway. The game starts out as a modern Benoni, and we follow a standard line, launching the attack usually associated with 4 pawns, because the pawns at c4 and e6 would still have been on the board in many cases. Both sides manage to develop, but white has a lot of pressure in the center. Black can reduce that pressure in 2 ways, by putting a rook at e8 or a bishop at g4, but sometimes black prefers to try to distract white by playing on the queen side with b5. Now, this pawn should not be captured, because if the knight captures, then the important central pawn will fall. Instead, the recommended move according to theory is to push in the center, and I was well prepared and was following the theoretical recommendation, at least this far. After the pawns are traded, the knight is supposed to go to g4, and then I get a slight advantage by putting my bishop at g5. However, my opponent chose unwisely here and put the knight at d7, which at the time was unknown to the general theory. Since I was going to play bishop g5, if the knight went to g4, I decided to follow the standard plan. I did overlook a somewhat stronger move. After the knight retreats, I can keep up the attack immediately with e6. I was worried that I might be overextending a little bit with this, but it turns out that if the knight moves, then f7 is weakened, and now, in order to get the pawn at d5, black would have to give up the powerful bishop, and it turns out that then the attack on f7 continues, forcing the rook to leave. It's exchanged off. Black can threaten g2, but that's well defended, and because f7 no longer has a pawn, all I have to do is get my bishop to e6 and the black queen would fall. So in the game that was played by Izbulatov against Zakharov in Kazan in 1997, the bishop came to g4, and black could find nothing better than a rather useless piece sacrifice, which was easily won by white. But I didn't look at the e6 plan, so I just went ahead with the second best move, which is bishop g5. And now I should probably retreat the bishop to f4 and just keep that strong center intact. Instead, looking at the diagonal leading to the rook at a8, I decided to open things up a little bit by planting my bishop on e7 and then pushing the pawn forward. Black, of course, seizes the diagonal, and now I could take the pawn on b5, but after bishop takes b5, black would have played a6, and then if I exchange, both the e-pawn and the pawn at b2 are attacked. So that wasn't too good. I did think about putting my knight on d5, but then queen a5 check would perhaps be annoying. So instead, I followed general opening guidelines and simply castled. I wasn't worried about the knight taking on e5, which is what my opponent played. I was a little bit concerned about c4 check, when probably the best move would have been rook to f2. But my opponent grabbed the pawn as expected. And now I took the pawn at b5 and attacked the rook at e8. Black should simply have stuck his bishop at c6, blocking the line. But instead, he overreacted and took my knight off at c3. Now, of course, if I capture the bishop, he'll take my bishop at b5. So instead, I take the rook, then he gets to save his bishop with a check, and I'm up the exchange, and I still have a good attack at f7. Black's problems have resulted mostly from that retreat from the knight at f6 to d7, because the knight at b8 still hasn't entered the game. Now, Black thought things were somewhat under control after bishop to d5, but f7 is always a vulnerable target, and you have to look at sacrificing there whenever it's available. It doesn't mean that it'll be the best move, but if you look at a sacrifice in every situation, you can figure out which circumstances you need to bring about to make the sacrifice successful. Here, I realized it would work right away, because there's a connection between f7 and a8, as you'll see. After the bishop sacrifice, the rook goes, and now you can see that from f3, my queen attacks the rook at a8 as well as puts the king in check. So with a wink at the king and one eye firmly on the prize at a8, I managed to obtain a winning game. After the king retreated, I got rid of the rook. My b-pawn falls. Now I have to be a little bit careful, because if I allow the rook to fall, it's also going to be checkmate on the back rank. But no problem. My rook comes over and threatens to get to the 8th rank itself. Black could have resigned with a clear conscience here, but the game continued for a few more moves. Trying to get a new queen, the c-pawn advances, but it's much too slow. I set up some nasty discovered checks. Black avoided them. I switched to the diagonal. And now a small sacrifice brings victory. It looks as though Black controls d7, but I'm not concerned about that, because after he took the pawn, the check forces the king back, and now the next check caused my opponent to resign, because at this point, if he went back further, I would give the check, and then I would ignore the knight and give checkmate. So this game saw a connection between a8 and f7, and a tactical trick that you can sometimes use to win material.